section of chapter 9, and we're going to go ahead and talk about what is arguably not a super exciting topic, which is the issue of incest. And as stated here in my slide, almost every human culture has some sort of prohibition on any sort of sexual relationship or marriage between people that are defined as related to each other. This is what we call the incest taboo. It's a very hard and fast rule. It's a prohibition that says absolutely not. You absolutely cannot have a relationship with someone that you are related to. So, a couple of interesting things about the incest taboo. One, it's universal. As I said, with a few notable exceptions, such as ancient Egyptians or ancient Hawaiian royalty, almost every human culture says that incest is absolutely forbidden. The other interesting thing, though, is that not all cultures define quote-unquote relatedness in the same way. So what one culture may say is incest, like for instance, our culture says that if two cousins were to get married, that would be considered incest. However, if we were in other parts of the world, that would be considered perfectly normal. So we need to do a deeper dive into the incest taboo to see exactly how cultures are defining it and what some of the theories are for why this rule is in place. Okay, so there are four main explanations, and no single explanation can 100% account for why this hardcore rule exists in all cultures. Let's start with the one that I'm sure instantly comes to your mind when you think of why incest is forbidden. It would be this one right here, inbreeding theory or inbreeding avoidance. Usually when I ask students in class, okay, give me one explanation for why incest is prohibited, the first thing students say is that it's bad for genetics, that there will be bad offspring if two people that are related have a sexual relationship. And while incest doesn't suddenly cause mutations or horrible deformities like the stuff of horror movies, it is true that there is a much, much higher likelihood that when two people that are related have offspring, that those offspring could inherit harmful genes. So again, if we think of the idea that two people that are related share almost the exact same DNA, that means that these two people would also have the same negative traits or harmful alleles. Even if those alleles are recessive, when they share identical DNA, the likelihood those harmful alleles are passed on and magnified in their offspring becomes much, much, much greater. So yes, it's true that there can be harmful genetic effects or negative inbreeding when people that are related have offspring. What's the criticism of this? Well, humans for a very, very long time have been forbidding incest, and yet we know that modern genetics, or our basic understanding of how DNA works or how traits are passed on, that's very, very recent. So that means that there were a lot of cultures that were operating under the incest taboo that had no idea about genes or alleles, and they certainly weren't using a biomedical explanation for why incest is forbidden. So this can't explain everything. Okay, another theory that probably would instantly come to mind for many of you would be the answer to the question, well, would you ever want to marry your brother? Most of us would be incredibly grossed out. We'd almost have this like instant ew reaction, like it's almost physical reaction, the thought of having a relationship with someone we're related to. That one is actually going to be highlighted here. Childhood familiarity. According to this theory, when you grow up in intimate contact with someone in childhood, you have a sexual aversion to that person, i.e., you have zero desire to be romantic with this individual. So again, this is pretty obvious when you think about your siblings. You grew up in intimate contact with them, you have no desire for them romantically. So this theory can even be expanded to people that you're not genetically related to. So let's say you grew up with an adoptive sibling, or maybe you grew up with step siblings that are not at all genetically related to you, but that still lived in your household. Even in those cases, people tend to avoid those types of relationships. There actually is anthropological evidence that supports the childhood familiarity theory. Two different examples that are mentioned in your book. One is an ancient Taiwan tradition called Simpua marriage. In this case, it's what we might refer to child betrothal, meaning that in infancy, a baby boy and a baby girl would be promised to each other. But the baby boy's family would actually adopt the baby girl, his future wife, and raise her 100% in their family. Well, when these two babies ended up growing up and becoming adults, and they were told that they were going to marry each other, needless to say, they were not incredibly happy to learn that they had to marry the brother or sister that they essentially grew up with. When anthropologists have studied these marriages, they found high rates of dissatisfaction and lots of couples that pretty much avoided each other all the time. Another great example of the childhood familiarity theory would be examples from kibbutzes in Israel. So kibbutzes are essentially communes, and they're not as common now, but were pretty common in like the 70s. And this is where a bunch of different unrelated families would live cooperatively. And so they would all raise their children together. So the children would play together, they would work together, they would go to school together, they would be taken care of together, eat together, sleep together, bathe together. You get where I'm going. So they were basically co-parented by all the families. Well, anthropologists followed up with these kids once they became adults and once they moved out and married, and they found out that no one married other individuals that were from their same kibbutz. Again, these people aren't genetically related, so it's perfectly acceptable, we could think, for them to marry each other. However, when they interviewed them, they said that the other kids from their kibbutz felt like siblings. They felt related. So that, again, would support this idea that when you're really familiar with someone in childhood, you do not want to marry them. Now, the exception to this rule, or the criticism, would be if this was the case, then we would never, ever, ever have any instances of incest. Like if everyone is just hardwired to totally not want anything to do with a sibling, then why do we still have incest? And why do we still have such a harsh taboo? If it was just natural for people to avoid each other, we wouldn't even need a rule in the first place. Okay, let's talk about the last two, and then I'll stop the mini lecture. So, family disruption theory. If any of you learned about Freud in a psychology class, or maybe in your high school social sciences, you will know that Freud was pretty obsessed with desire within the family. And so the family disruption theory says that if family members desire each other or have sexual relationships with each other, that will destabilize the family and disrupt the basic unit of the household. So you have to put, or the basic unit of society, really. So you have to put an incest taboo in place to prevent family members from having relationships with each other. Again, the theory would be that it would create conflict between family members, competition, jealousy, confusion over whose role is what within the family. So we have to put the taboo in place to prevent this from happening. So the criticism of this theory, though, is that we don't have any evidence. I mean, yeah, it sounds pretty logical, but no one has gone and studied families, told them to all have relationships with each other, and then just see what happens. One, that's completely unethical and rather disturbing. But two, it's not like we can go out and ask families, hey, have you all had sexual relationships with each other? Okay, great. Can we study you? So we just don't have evidence for this theory. It sounds good, but we don't know for sure. Okay, lastly, this idea of marry out or die out, that's going to relate to another marriage rule that we'll talk about in the next section, which is the idea of exogamy. Marry out or die out means you must marry outside of your community so that you can form important alliances and get resources from other communities. So the tag phrase for this theory, marry out or die out, is implying that if you only married within your community, you could become so isolated. You wouldn't have any social allies, political allies, and you also wouldn't have access to any resources outside of your own community, that your community could actually die out. So the theory here is that they put an incest taboo in place so that people are forced to marry outside of their community. Again, we have some evidence against this. What if you are part of a royal family and you have more resources and more wealth than you could ever desire in a lifetime? Then, in fact, marrying outside would actually take away from your resources, as in other people would get access to it. So, for instance, one of the reasons that we see evidence of incest among ancient Egyptians is because, one, they were super rich, the royalty, and so they had no need for resources from other people. Two, they also believed they were gods. And so, of course, they didn't want to marry some random person in Egyptian society. Of course, they had to marry their brother or sister because that was the only other god in the room, so to speak. So you can see why marry out or die out makes sense if you think about how most societies need resources and allies, but we can think of notable exceptions when we think of again, like ancient Hawaiians, or if you want to think of the Lannisters, might be another good example of why this theory doesn't hold up. So, as you can see, it's pretty complicated. You would think something as incest taboo would be pretty straightforward, just don't do it. But as we can see when we actually look at it cross-culturally, there's lots of different ways that we could potentially explain why this rule exists all over the world. So, you'll see there's 4 different theories. They all have benefits to the theory, and they all have criticism. So, that's the end of this little section. And in the next mini lecture, I'll talk about some of the other rules for marriage when we get there. So until that point.